All right, I'll let you know right up front, I'm really excited about doing this particular video because I think that it is centric to the comms aspect of being prepared. When, we need help, that's usually no more than an easy, quick call away, but what happens when that's no longer an option? Emergency preparedness is all about the self-preservation of, number one, yourself, but then, your family and maybe even your community. And in this video, we're gonna get into it a little bit.
This afternoon, Honolulu police reporting a brief 911 outage in the city, coming after more outages Wednesday night on the mainland.
But first, we're going to get right to Alicia Nieves in New York City, where, Alicia, you say 911 systems are down.
911 outages impacted several agencies today, including some here in the Pine Belt. Jones County emergency leaders say cut fiber is likely to blame for the problem that had many counties turning to their plan B.
You may have difficulty reaching us internally, and we're having difficulty receiving 911 calls as well.
And overnight in busy Las Vegas, residents couldn't get through to 911 on cell phones or landlines for 2 hours.
Andrew?
Already, ransomware attacks on 911 centers, including Bucks County, Pennsylvania, have forced dispatchers to revert to manual systems. In 2017, 911 centers in more than a dozen states were paralyzed.
911 outages hit at least 8 states in 2024, and more than 3/4 of call centers experienced outages in the last 12 months. And that's according to a survey that was just done in February by the NENA, which is the National Emergency Number Association. And they just really set the standard and advocate for the 911 system. So these outages are emblematic of problems that are just plaguing emergency communications, due in part to, just wide disparities in the system's age and capabilities. It also has to do with the funding of the 911 systems across the country. In some states and some cities and some counties, they have really modernized their systems, but others have simply just made plans to upgrade or just haven't done anything with it yet. And a lot of the systems out there are just really severely lagging. If you weren't aware, the U.S. debuted the single universal 911 emergency number back in February of 1968 to simplify crisis response. But of course, you ready for it? Instead of just a seamless national program, the 911 response network has evolved into this massive puzzle of interlocking pieces. There are more than 6,000 911 call centers to handle an estimated 240 million emergency calls each year. With that, if you're paying attention, all signs are pointing to the nation's 911 system being on the brink of its own emergency. Case in point, just after lunchtime on June 18th, so almost a year ago, Massachusetts leaders discovered that the statewide 911 system was down. So in response to this, what the police do, they texted out the administrative numbers that callers could use, and officials advised people to summon help by pulling red fire alarm boxes. That's right. This, isn't necessarily a horrible idea at face value. And having been a New York City firefighter, I'm pretty familiar with those fire alarm boxes because in New York City, these pull boxes are still present and functional. The issue with them is you have no idea as to the nature of the emergency because it is just, essentially a beacon for assistance, and you have to be in an area that actually has these already in place. And those things are pretty old school. They come back to the old box alarm type systems. If you're not familiar, the cities way back when, and they still use them to this day, are, kind of organized into box areas. And what would happen is the reason they call those, box alarms when a fire department gets dispatched to something is way back when, before phones, if there was an emergency, you would go to the, pull box and pull as a request for assistance. And that would send a signal to the, emergency center, and they would say, hey, there's an alarm on box 141 or whatever the box was. And then they would look at the wall basically, and there would be an intersection as to where that box was. They would have people respond to that intersection to find out what the emergency was. And then once they were there, especially again, we're talking about the fires here, if you weren't familiar where the terms second alarm and third alarm come from, that would be because, you'd have the fire department essentially respond to that box alarm. They were there, the fire's bigger than they thought it was, or they needed more help. So the chief essentially that was on scene would go ahead and pull the same box again. So the dispatch center would basically report it as, there's now a second alarm on box. Again, we used 141 as the example. So they would send more units to that particular intersection to deal with the emergency.
Open telephone alarm box 3780, now receiving the address 413 East 3rd Street. That's between Beverly Road and Avenue C for a house fire. Broken on 147.
Then we go to just in April of 2024, there was a widespread 911 outage that affected millions in Nebraska, Nevada, South Dakota, and Texas. And then in February of 2024, tens of thousands of people in the areas of California, Georgia, Illinois, Texas, and other states lost cell phone service, including some 911 services from an outage. And once again, last June, Verizon agreed to pay just over $1 million as a fine to settle a Federal Communications Commission probe into a December 2022 outage that affected 911 calls in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. So yes, this shit happens everywhere, all across the country. And let's not forget about the Maui wildfires. This highlighted the critical importance of 911 systems. Dispatchers there, they filled up more than 4,500 contacts on that day compared to about 400 on a typical day. So in response to all this, what have our lawmakers done? Well, they've looked at modernizing 911 systems by tapping revenue from the FCC, from auctioning off the rights to transmit on specific bands. But the US Senate in March of 2023, for the first time ever, allowed a lapse of the FCC's authority to auction spectrum bands. Legislation that would allocate almost $15 billion in grants from auction proceeds to speed deployment of next generation 911 in every state. This was unanimously passed by the House Energy and Commerce Committee in May of 2023. And other bills have also been introduced by various lawmakers to extend the auction authority. But for now, none have advanced. 9 former FCC chairs wrote lawmakers in February urging them to make 911 upgrades a national priority. And they suggested Congress to tap unspent federal COVID-19 money to do just that. The craziest thing is, this isn't something that isn't hitting close to home for our nation's lawmakers. DC's dispatch system has had 18 disruptions since December. One of those outages coincided with the death of a 5-month-old baby whose family said their first 911 call wasn't even answered. An internal review by DC's OUC has identified a common cause for the trouble, except for the acknowledgement that they have old equipment that can't handle the demand. DC fields the highest number of calls for police, fire, and EMS per capita in the US. The most recent incident at the time of this video occurred on October 24th, 2024 in New Haven, Connecticut. So really, just a few months ago. By 11:50 a.m. on Tuesday, it was clear the city's 911 operators had a problem. There, when 911 operators tried to make calls from the system's landline phones, they, whether it was to check on a civilian in trouble or connect with another department, they were met with just a fast stream of discordant beeps. The public safety answering point, where they were still receiving incoming calls and text to 911 was still working, but the monitor showed that every successful caller was using a T-Mobile or AT&T only affiliated cell phone. No landlines and no Verizon wireless calls were coming through. And then by midday on Tuesday, all of their 911 centers were down and the non-emergency line wasn't working either. The crazy thing about this, and think about this for a second, text to 911 was functioning until right after an alert went out to cell phone users notifying them of the outage, but advising them that the text to 911 was working. So what did people do? They tried to test out whether the text to 911 would go through, and they ended up crashing that system too. So now for the $1 million question, or really at least the question for the whole point of making this video is, what can we do about this? Or what can I do about this? And I preach all of the time that if you can predict a situation and fail to plan and train for it, then shame on you. Amateur radio was built on a foundation of emergency communications planning and capabilities. There are two big groups out there. First is the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Services, or RACES, and they are an emergency radio service authorized by Part 97 of the FCC. And you have ARES, or the Amateur Radio Emergency Service, and they are a trained group of, or they're really both trained groups of amateur radio operator volunteers that are organized to assist in public service and emergency communications. They're organized and sponsored by the American Radio Relay League, and many of these clubs or groups, hold regular meetings, trainings, and drills. And down the road, I may decide to do a more in-depth video on each of those groups. Now, the issue that I see with these groups, and let me know in the comments if you're a part of one of these groups, if you agree with me or if you disagree with me, but from what I've seen firsthand, and I feel like this was also the case with the Hurricane Helene response, is that all of the drills and whatnot that these groups do, they always evolve around supporting or supplementing the local government's communication systems from a centralized location. And here's where I feel the mark is missed a little bit. Bringing this back and focusing, it in on our own or your own emergency preparedness plans would be to start your pre-planning now. So where I'm located, law enforcement kind of heads up the CERT teams, which, if you're not familiar, stands for the Civilian Emergency Response Team. So literally, community invested, very initial first responders. And I actually started off in the undertaking of some of our local teams. And then unfortunately, other primary duties came to call, and I just couldn't commit to the implementation and training for it. So it didn't go anywhere. And I do plan on revisiting this because I had the program created and I just needed to put it into action. But anyway, it really centered around having local people that were actually properly trained and, for lack of better terms, certified. And then in addition to having the personnel located in the Emergency Operations Center, or as was in Helene, just, the single net control command location, having predetermined locations, for instances, firehouses, gas stations, intersections, doesn't really matter, but have them mapped out and numbered, and then through public awareness events, education, and even distribution of these maps, it would be known that if phone communications went down, these ARES or RACES or CERT members, etc., they would be in a vehicle that was readily identifiable through some sort of marking device of your choosing, and as long as it's consistent across your community. So that is, just as long as whatever you're using to do it, it's easily identifiable. And if you needed help, you would simply get to one of these locations, and someone with a radio would be there, not only to provide some initial aid if needed, or possibly, depending on the nature and severity of the request of assistance, possibly mediate it completely if it's something that's very minor. And all these guys would have bleeding control training, so something minor they could handle. And if it was out of their scope, well, they have the means of communications for summoning EMS or fire, law enforcement, whatever it would be that was needed. So they'd be able to get a hold of the centralized communication center to give the call for need of assistance and get emergency services to the location. The beauty of a system like this is that when disasters strike, areas are always affected, or certain areas are always affected harder than others. And the simplicity of a system or plan like this allows for the fact that no infrastructure at these sites are required. And if it would be so devastated that the location literally didn't exist anymore, like areas literally falling or sliding off or being washed away, like with Hurricane Helene, then not too much further down should be another reporting location. So it should look something like this. Here's a like a sample map of how it would kind of be laid out.
So looking here, this is just a sample map that I generated on one of the mapping programs that we use. And this thing is actually really cool. As you can see here, just for, again, the sake of doing this video, we made, a town that has a river that cuts through it. So this could be some sort of flooding event or just a 911 outage issue. We can see kind of in the middle of town. That's where our EOC is located. And then it's nice because with this program, you can put range rings in. So we did a range ring every half mile. As you can see, they kind of come out to realize the distances you're going to need to cover. With here, you can see we designated the affected area in red. And you can make as many of these affected areas or any of these shapes that you would need, and you can make them in any color you would need. And then as you can see, as we were saying, the way we would have these places predetermined is either at intersections. You can see here we put like Aries 1 and then Aries 3 and Aries 2, whatever their actual call sign would be. And then we had the CERT team members that we talked about integrated in this as well. So this is one of those things you could look at this and say, okay, these would all be predetermined points that these groups through training and planning would know where to respond to, and they would just set up here and stand by. And this is what I was alluding to just a second ago, where say if this area here due to flooding, if from here from your 2 mile range ring in was underwater and just not accessible, well, that's no big deal, because you would still be able to see the points that needed to be filled. And you can also very easily add additional points to this, because this mapping software is pretty good. We do this for mission planning. You can do this for pre-planning your own town. We do this for actual unit tracking capabilities. And then you can get into even some, potential, person behavior predictability just based off of the terrain mapping features it can do as well. So it's a really powerful tool. Definitely something, if you're interested in it, we can get into it. We can do training just on this software. So just one more thing to add into your toolbox and have you, just another option you can do for helping come up with a plan and kind of bring it to life that can, pay dividends in the future.
So let me know what you think about this video in the comments. Every like and comment and subscription and share really helps keep me motivated to, keep producing this content. If you have any plans like this established, let me know that. If you want to know about training requirements, or if you are interested in getting medical, radio, and rescue training, let's talk and we'll see what I can, get set up for you or your group, because if you want it, maybe some other people around you do, and we can get a class put together. Also, please don't forget to check out the store on the medicineandbadplaces.com website. We have, there's hats there. Our hats are really nice. We have the thick and comfortable hoodies, as well as our t-shirts and patches. So please keep supporting us. Thank you everyone that does watch these videos and enjoys the content. So with that, keep researching, keep training, and as always, be safe.